I just want the members of this House to know that I sat beside Joe McDade, a member of Congress, for 8 years while he was investigated for 6 years, the most insidious tactics you could possibly use against Joe McDade.
Welcome to a special edition of the LaRouche Connection on the McDade-Murtha House debate, a revolution in American politics. It's Wednesday, August 12, 1998. My name is Tony Pappert, and with me is EIR Counterintelligence Director Jeff Steinberg. Jeff, 1 week ago, last Wednesday, something happened on the floor of the House which most Americans would never have considered possible in this day and age. Could you tell us about it?
Well, not only would most Americans consider it impossible in this day and age, but most Americans are unaware of what happened on the floor of the House last Wednesday unless they happen to be fortunate enough to either be subscribers to Executive Intelligence Review or New Federalist, or happen to be glued to their TV sets last Wednesday watching the debate as it was aired on C-SPAN. What happened is extraordinary. There was a 3-hour debate on the floor of the House concerning the McDade-Murtha bill, otherwise known as the Citizens Protection Act of 1998. Now, this bill was introduced by Congressman Joseph McDade, a Republican from Pennsylvania, early this year. It was co-sponsored by another Pennsylvania congressman, a Democrat named John Murtha. And as the bill proceeded through early discussions among members of Congress, it won the support of a bipartisan group of about 30 or 40 legislators. The McDade-Murtha bill proposed to create two things in particular. Number one, an outside supervisory agency to review allegations of corruption by officials of the Justice Department. And the bill itself, which is known as H.R. 3396, also included a specific itemization of some of the more egregious and most frequently committed crimes by federal prosecutors. For example, federal prosecutors withholding exculpatory evidence from defendants. That's to say, evidence that would tend to prove the innocence of a target of Justice Department prosecution. The soliciting of perjured testimony by witnesses to obtain convictions illegally. The bribing of witnesses, and there's many, many forms that witness bribery takes, and some of these are itemized in the McDade-Murtha bill. For example, offering witnesses who themselves have committed crimes, very often more serious crimes than those that the target is accused of. Prosecutors will routinely grant immunity from prosecution to people in order to get testimony against targets, political targets, of the Justice Department and of the private sector financial oligarchy, whose interests very often are those being pursued by the DOJ. So McDade-Murtha itemized all of these bills. It created an outside oversight board to review allegations of crime by federal prosecutors, the board to be appointed by the President and by leaders of the Congress. So that's one very big element of McDade-Murtha. The other thing that McDade-Murtha did was to assert that all officials of the Justice Department, and really this includes the independent counsels, which is a statute supervised by the Department of Justice, that all of these people are accountable not only to federal law, but to state ethical standards and state law as well. A good example of the kinds of things covered by McDade-Murtha is the illegal tapes that Linda Tripp did of her conversations with Monica Lewinsky. Under McDade-Murtha, it's questionable whether Ken Starr's office could have legally used the fruit of a state crime, the illegal taping in Maryland, which is now a subject of grand jury investigation, to further an investigation by the independent counsel's office. So this bill was introduced by McDade and Murtha early this year, and it got a certain amount of momentum, and then it sort of died out. Fortunately, a syndicated columnist, Paul Craig Roberts, published a column about McDade-Murtha it came to our attention, and we obtained a copy of the bill. Our legal staff at Executive Intelligence Review reviewed the bill and found that it was really an outstanding piece of legislation. It had no downside to it, no compromising elements. And at that point, the LaRouche political movement was activated all across the United States to win additional support for the bill. And beginning in about March of this year and extending through the 4th of July congressional recess, average citizens, LaRouche activists from every state in the Union engaged in perhaps the most substantial and important political mobilization that has been undertaken in this country in recent memory. Literally hundreds of members of Congress themselves met in their district offices or on Capitol Hill with LaRouche collaborators, very often average citizens, full-time jobs, full-time family responsibilities, but who've been drawn into this political movement. As the result of that effort, by the end of the 4th of July recess, the McDade-Murtha bill had 207 co-sponsors, and momentum was moving very rapidly towards getting 218 co-sponsors, which would have been a majority of members of the Congress. At that point, Representative McDade made a move which in hindsight has proven to have been a very sharp political move. He introduced the full text of the McDade-Murtha bill as an amendment to the House Appropriations Bill for the Justice Department, the State Department, and the Department of Commerce. That amendment was adopted by the Appropriations Subcommittee. It passed through the Rules Committee, and as the result, it was amended as Title VIII of the House Appropriations Bill for State Justice and Commerce. And as the result, it bypassed a certain process in committee and went directly to the floor of the House of Representatives. Now, as this process was unfolding, the Justice Department, permanent bureaucracy, their various networks of influence within the Association of Assistant U.S. Attorneys, the Association of FBI agents, other similar groups, as well as the Justice Department apparatus itself, launched a massive counter-effort to attempt to prevent additional members of Congress from endorsing the bill, to arm twist members of Congress, exploiting some members who were former federal prosecutors, utilizing staffers who were former federal prosecutors. At one point, there were more U.S. attorneys, current and former, running around Capitol Hill, lobbying and arm twisting against this bill than any number of lobbyists you ever saw for the tobacco industry or for the pharmaceutical industry or other things. Attorney General Janet Reno, at one of her regular Thursday morning press conferences at the Justice Department in May, came out with a scathing attack against McDade-Murtha. By the way, most of the, quote, facts that she cited in her opposition with McDade-Murtha were all false. They were just simply trumped-up allegations. At one point, prosecutors got so hysterical that they claimed that this was a bill to benefit drug traffickers, and it's nothing of the sort. So an enormous political brawl broke out, and as the result of that whole process, especially the continuing political mobilization of the LaRouche movement, which then instigated action by other constituency groups, everything from the National Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers to the organization representing state Supreme Court justices, to the Hispanic caucus in Congress, all got into the act. And so an enormous political groundswell created the conditions where 1 week ago today, there was, as I said, a incredible, impassioned 3-hour debate on the floor of the House. There was a amendment introduced by assets of the Justice Department to strike the language of McDade-Murtha from the appropriations bill. So that was the framework for the debate. And the upshot of it is that by an overwhelming bipartisan majority, the McDade-Murtha language was kept in, and then ultimately the following day, the bill itself, the full appropriations bill, passed out of the House and now goes into conference.
The amendment to strike the McDade-Murtha language from the appropriations bill was introduced by two ex-prosecutors from the South, Republican Congressman Hutchinson from Arkansas and Republican Congressman Barr from Georgia. We could take just a moment now to watch their argument against the McDade-Murtha Citizens Protection Act. All of this took place, as I say, last Wednesday, August 5th.
Mr. Chairman, I rise in support of the Hutchinson-Barr-Bryant amendment. The distinguished Chairman Hal Rogers from Kentucky has done a masterful job in developing this appropriations bill, but Title VIII, which our amendment would strike, goes far afield from the ordinary requirements of a spending bill. It includes almost verbatim the well-intentioned but ill-advised Citizen Protection Act. Including this legislative title in the bill violates the normal process in this House by bypassing committee hearings and markups, but even more importantly, it is wrong on substance. The proposed Title VIII, which is the subject of our amendment, would cut to the heart of our federal system of justice and would cripple the war on drugs. And for that reason, it is understandable that the National Director of Drug Control Policy, Barry McCaffrey, opposes this provision, as well as the DEA, the FBI, and the National Sheriff's Association. Even though the authors of Title VIII are sincere in their efforts, the effect would be devastating and demoralizing to our agents and officers risking their lives each day to fight crime. I know that is why all former United States attorneys now serving in Congress are co-sponsors of this amendment and are leading in this effort. Now, we all agree on one thing, and that is that our federal prosecutors should live up to the highest ethical standards. The proponents of Title VIII say that they just want government attorneys to be subject to state ethics laws. The fact is they already are. Every government attorney is required to abide by the rules and ethical guidelines in the state they are licensed to practice law. This means the ethical conduct of federal prosecutors are reviewed by the state in which they are licensed, at the federal level by the Office of Professional Responsibility within the Department of Justice, the Inspector General of the Department of Justice, and the federal courts. In addition, we just passed a law that said that if any prosecution is brought in a frivolous fashion, then the acquitted defendant could recover attorney's fees from the government. But the proposed legislation goes way too far. It would subject all attorneys, federal attorneys, and the state and local attorneys with whom they work to conflicting state conduct rules. For example, if a federal prosecutor licensed in Virginia had to interview a cooperating witness in a drug case in Florida and then oversee the use of a confidential informant in California, then he would have to worry about the rules of each state because he is engaging in his duties in those states. And you multiply this by the number of investigations during the course of the year, you could have the attorneys for the government spending all their times
on 802, but this
I want to be able to complete my statement. I'd be happy to yield to the conclusion. The second problem is that the proposed legislation would allow criminal defense attorneys to bring frivolous ethics complaints against federal, state, and local prosecutors. Creates a new federal bureaucracy called the Misconduct Review Board to try ethics complaints under vague standards like, quote, bringing discredit to the department, end quote. This board, the Misconduct Review Board, will have access. They will have subpoena power and they will have access to pending criminal investigations. All their hearings will be public and open to review. They can subpoena the names of witnesses and informants, the identities of undercover law enforcement officials who have infiltrated the operations of the criminal subjects. If Congress passes this legislation, then the public will suffer. The winners would be the drug cartels, fraudulent telemarketing operations that prey on the sick and the elderly, and internet pornographers who prey on children. Why do I say that? Because all of these crimes involve multi-state investigations that would be hampered by the newly created ethics bureaucracy. For example, in the days following the Oklahoma City bombing, federal prosecutors and agents conducted simultaneous investigations in several states. Under the proposal, the laws and rules of each state would have governed the conduct of department prosecutors, no matter how inconsistent those rules might have been. What was permitted in one state might not have been permitted in another state. And because of the far-reaching and crushing impact of this proposal in law enforcement, it is understandable that so many in the law enforcement community have opposed this bill, from the National Sheriff's Association the National District Attorneys Association, state prosecutors, the FBI, the National Association of Attorney Generals, the National Black Prosecutors Association, the New York State District Attorneys Association, the FBI, the DEA, the Fraternal Order of the Police. But what was significant, that 6 former Attorney Generals of the United States, from Benjamin Civiletti to Edmund Meese, from Democrats to Republicans, all 6 have urged this House to reject this proposal and to support this amendment. I urge my colleagues to support the amendment and not give way to the drug dealers and the defense attorneys, another weapon to use against law enforcement in our vital efforts on the war on drugs.
Gentleman from Georgia.
Mr. Chairman, this is almost as bizarre as the words we heard earlier in opposition to the Hutchison-Barr-Bryan amendment. What we're witnessing here, under the guise of the usual flowery language emanating forth from the proponents of this latest foray, is really precisely what they purport to be against, and that is a backdoor effort to do something that they don't either have the courage to do.
The gentleman is not addressing a point of order, Mr. Chairman. I demand the regular order.
The gentleman, in the opinion of the chair, is addressing the point of order. The gentleman will continue.
Thank you. What this amendment purports to do is to amend the independent counsel statute to make a political point about the independent counsel statute not allowable under the rules of the House as an amendment to an appropriations bill. It purports, therefore, to legislate substantively, and the words of the gentleman from Illinois make this very clear. He is launching a political attack on the statutory authority of the independent counsel, something which is not the subject matter of this appropriations bill, and certainly is not the subject matter of this amendment, the Hutchison-Barr-Bryan amendment. Therefore, I would urge the chair to sustain the point of order, as this is an effort by Mr. Conyers to legislate, and not only to legislate an appropriations bill, but in a way that goes far beyond the language and subject matter of the underlying amendment itself.
Tony, by the way, a third member of Congress, Congressman Bryant from Tennessee, another former federal prosecutor who was directly involved in the aforementioned frame-up prosecution of Congressman Ford,
right,
was also a co-sponsor of that bill. So you get a sense that this was the defenders of the Justice Department coming forward and doing everything in their power to blunt the incredible momentum in support of McDade Murtha, both popular momentum in the American public and momentum among a vast majority of members of the Congress. Now, I want to just say that the historical nature, the revolutionary character of what occurred last week in Congress can only be appreciated if you remember that in the late 1970s, early 1980s, the U.S. Congress itself was the target of frame-up attacks by the Justice Department, by the FBI. In fact, as we're going to see in a few moments when we look at some of the debate, a number of members of Congress referred to instances where congressmen were themselves targeted for frame-up. So from the early 1980s, when the infamous Operation Abscam targeted Congress, brought down some of the leading constituency leaders in Congress, this institution, the legislative branch of our federal government, has in effect been powerless. It has been particularly powerless when it comes to any issues related to the Department of Justice. For example, over the last few years, we saw the attempts to go at the question of the massacre at Waco. We saw the attempts to raise the issue of the massacre at Ruby Ridge. There was a certain amount of momentum built up around congressional hearings on the LaRouche case, perhaps the biggest political massacre of all. And all of this was blunted whenever it came up to attacking the permanent bureaucracy. Congress completely punted. So this is really a revolution to reestablish the integrity of the congressional branch of government. Now, this was a subject that was addressed repeatedly throughout the 1980s by Lyndon LaRouche. For example, in 1984, during his presidential campaign, he aired a broadcast in which he directly took up the case of Senator Harrison Williams, which was one of the most egregious cases of frame-up to occur in the entire abscam sequence. Let's take a brief look at a segment of that 1984 LaRouche broadcast.
Senator Harrison Williams was not murdered by the Federal Bureau of Investigation, but his case is an example of that same immorality in government we see more vividly in the form of genocide against black Africa and in the form of Nazi-like policies of euthanasia against our invalids and against our senior citizens. According to the evidence presented by the U.S. Department of Justice in federal court, Senator Williams not only refused any offer of a bribe, but was in the process of lecturing what he believed to be an Arab guest in our country, that in our country such practices are not tolerated.
No, no, no.
Yet the senator was convicted. An innocent U.S. senator sent to prison on the instruction of a federal judge. He was convicted and sentenced on the grounds that he looked like a public official who might have taken a bribe at some other time.
So you can see that the LaRouche political movement did not jump into this McDade-Murtha fight at the last moment. This has been an underlying issue that we have been hammering at for years. And I think you can see in Mr. LaRouche's remarks from that mid-1980s TV broadcast that there's an enormous amount of passion and commitment to tackling the tyranny of the Justice Department permanent bureaucracy here at EIR and within the LaRouche movement overall. I think what we're going to see right now, though, which is remarkable, is that same level of passion, that same degree of truth-seeking and courage from a wide number of members of Congress on both sides of the aisle. So without any further ado, why don't we give our viewers an opportunity to see some important segments of that debate.
I rise, of course, in unequivocal opposition to the amendment of the gentleman from Arkansas. Sometimes in this House we forget the watersheds that come our way and the moments of history that arrive here, sometimes not of our own making. That's the kind of a night we face tonight, because the question we're about to vote on involves the liberty of every citizen of this country. The bill is simple. Title I simply says, be ethical. Who supports it? All the chief justices of all the 50 states, the American Bar Association, every legal organization besides that who has taken a position, of course supports the proposition. Abide by the ethics rules. Title II. My Lord, folks, what clarity. Listen to all it says. It's not hostile to a prosecutor or to the effort to prosecution. It simply says, now listen to this. If you consider this hostile, tell me. Don't lie to the court. Oh, that's hostile to prosecution. Don't intimidate a witness or attempt to color their testimony. Hostile to the court. Hostile to the prosecutors. Don't leak information. Don't withhold exculpatory evidence on a person you're trying that may exonerate him or her. Hostile. Don't bring an indictment against a citizen of this country unless you have probable cause to prove that they have committed a crime. Those are the guidelines we set down for every citizen in this nation. I hope we'll all vote against the Hutchinson Amendment. Thank you.
Time of the gentleman has expired. All time has expired.
The most insidious tactics you could possibly use against Joe McDade. The appeals process, which is supposed to make sure that the federal prosecutors don't get out of control. The federal appeals process ruled 2-1 He went 2 years under indictment. The federal jury, which came from an area that said 70% of the politicians are crooks, ruled in 3 hours he was acquitted. In the indictment, they said campaign contributions are bribes. The rules of the House are clear about the legality of campaign contributions. That honorariums are illegal gratuities. That's what they charged them with. They were trying to intimidate a member of the House of Representatives. And in addition to that, in addition to trying to intimidate the House of Representatives and ignore the rules of the House, the public saw immediately he was reelected 2 times, 3 times during this period, when they leaked everything that could possibly be leaked, using those unethical tactics that we're talking about during this period of time. Then, after this is all over, they tried to promote the prosecutor to judge. Now, this is a member of Congress who was able to raise $1 million to defend himself. The ordinary citizen, the ordinary person, can't raise $1 million. The ordinary citizen can't even raise money to defend himself. And yet the public, at one time, used to think that a person was innocent until guilty. Now they get the impression, because of the leaks that come, the unethical leaks that come from the prosecutor, that the individual is guilty. I cannot tell you the physical and mental distress that Joe McDade went through. Now, I see what you're talking about, and maybe we have to look in conference at some exemptions in drug cartels and things like that. But I think this is a ploy by the prosecutors to continue their unethical conduct without any kind of regard to the ordinary citizen. We call this the Citizen Protection Act because we feel so strongly that Joe McDade is just an example. What he did for the House of Representatives is absolutely essential to our independence. But what we're trying to do for the ordinary citizen is absolutely important to their individual protection. And we believe we need an independent body to watch over them, to give them some sort of controls so that they don't go off without control and then be promoted, as somebody was after Waco and the terrible, terrible injustice they did to the individual in Atlanta with the leaks that came out of the Justice Department. So I feel very strongly that we have to get some kind of control. And the legislation that we drew, we hoped would come through the authorizing committee. Couldn't work it out at this late date.
Would the gentleman yield?
I am just about finished with my statement. And I just hope that the members, we have almost 200 co-sponsors of this legislation. We have said to the Justice Department, if you have individual situations that you would like us to look at, we would be glad to look at that. They haven't come back with anything. They just want to take this out. They don't want any kind of controls from the outside.
Mr. Chairman, I think it's time to put a human face on the abuses that are carried out by prosecutors in this country. Prosecutors who consistently violate the rights of innocent human beings, innocent citizens, and their families, friends, and relatives. And by putting a human face on, I'd like to refer to a predecessor that I had here in the Congress, a man who a number of years ago sat in the very seat that I occupy today, Angelo Roncallo. And what went on in his case has happened in so many other cases over the years. He was a man who was brought in by a United States attorney and told he had to deliver a political leader. When he refused to do that, he was called down before the grand jury. His family was harassed. He was indicted. His friends were indicted. Everything was leaked to the newspapers. This man's career was destroyed. He was defeated here in the United States Congress. Finally, his case went to trial. The jury was out 30 minutes, and he was acquitted. It came out during that case that all throughout, from day one, the prosecutors had complete evidence that would have completely exonerated this defendant. They knew it from day one. Throughout the trial, they had U.S. Marshals stand around the U.S. Attorney's Office because they had convinced the judge that this congressman, Angelo Roncallo, was somehow going to have them killed during the trial. The jury had to witness this, of marshals in the courtroom, day in and day out. When the trial was over, the judge said it was a disgrace, and he referred it to the Justice Department to have it investigated. What was done? Nothing. That's what always happens, nothing. And the gentleman from Georgia said it's bizarre. He said that opposition to the Hutchinson Amendment is bizarre. He said my good friend Mr. Murtha's comments were bizarre. I would say to the gentleman from Georgia, if he were targeted by a prosecutor, if they went after his family, if they tried to destroy his reputation, he would find that bizarre. And I think it's important for all of us in this chamber, those of us who are self-righteous, those of us who say it could never happen to us, let you be the target of an unscrupulous prosecutor, and you see how fast you'll change your tune when you see your wife harassed and your children. And I can go on and on with case after case. I remember I was once negotiating with a United States attorney in a case, and he ended the discussion, ended the negotiation by telling me that he was the United States of America. And it was time that I realized it. Well, the fact is, there's no prosecutor in this country as the United States of America. The United States of America is the people, and we represent the people. And it's time for us to stand up and say no to these prosecutors, no matter where they're coming from. Prosecutors are out of control. They are ruining the civil liberties of innocent people in this country. And as a Republican, I can't understand how people in my party who say they support individual rights could ever allow a prosecutor to trample upon the rights of innocent people, the abuses that they are guilty of. And I just want to concur in what Mr. Murtha said. I don't know how Joe McDade went through what he went through over the years and stood tall and survived it. He's a man of courage. He's a man who had the guts to stand up. But you think of the average citizen in your hometown, if they went after him, would he have that same guts? Would he have that stamina? Would his family be able to resist it? So I, again, urge and implore all of my colleagues to defeat the Hutchinson Amendment, to stand with Joe McDade, to stand with the Constitution, and say no to this untrammeled abuse of power by the prosecutors and our Justice Department today. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back the balance of his time.
Let me thank the prosecutors for going into the Deep South in the 1960s and raising up issues of civil rights that other local attorneys could not raise up. Let me thank them. The Department of Justice did an amazing job in dealing with those issues. So we realize the uniqueness of the federal prosecutor system. But does that mean that we throw people to the trash heap of life? Do you lose all of your rights because you go into a federal courtroom? Yes, I think our job might have been better if we had had hearings. In fact, I don't think we're finished. I think we must proceed and investigate even more whether there are abuses across the country. But today we are where we are. We have an opportunity not to attack, but to make better. This underlying amendment, and of course the amendment by my ranking member, Mr. Conyers, that includes the independent counsel, which is very clear, an employee of the Department of Justice is the independent counsel, will protect you, the citizen, against the kinds of abuses of which we face every day. There is something that is scripturally based. When the woman touched the hem of the garment of Jesus, in Christian doctrine, it was said she was healed. It is difficult, of course, to perceive prosecutors along those lines. But they say touch their garment and get no justice. That is the tragedy of what we face. And there is no disgrace for those of us who are members of the House Judiciary Committee to be able to say that Ken Starr has abused the process.
Limited government is the prerequisite for liberty and justice. That's what we're talking about today, limiting government power to what is a reasonable power to maintain order in our society. Well, however, over the last 3 decades, because of the fear of crime, we've ended up granting enormous power with very few checks and balances to prosecutors. We've just been expanding their power, and yours truly is just as guilty as anybody else out of fear of crime, to give prosecutors power without having any checks and balances. Now we're surprised to see that big government with lots of power, people in that government tend to abuse that power. Well, our founding fathers wouldn't be surprised at that. The fact is, every time you expand power, you have to put checks in place or there will be abuses of power. For far too many times we have seen out-of-control prosecutors who now have all this more power to attack the bad guys, not seeking truth or not trying to protect the innocent, but instead engaging themselves in self-aggrandizing, targeted attacks, often pushing relentlessly for some kind of prosecutorial victory, regardless of the cost, and at times, regardless of the actual guilt or innocence of the target. I and other supporters of the McDade-Murtha provision and we are advocates of law and order, take this stand today to protect freedom and liberty threatened by prosecutors who are not being held to the same standards as other people in the legal profession. Mr. Boyer answered these charges that there's going to be confusion, that you have different standards at the local level. The fact is, we expect our prosecutors to be at the highest level because we are protecting the rights of our citizens, the freedom of the people of the United States of America. Far too often, we've seen cases like Joe McDade, where prosecutors are out of control and politically motivated. They go out and destroy public officials and public people. But what about the little guys? The little guys who have no money to defend themselves and are faced by these same abusive prosecutors.
As a matter of fact, my father was indicted several years back by one of the prosecutors working with counsel Starr, Hickman Ewing. It was several years back, and after 5 years of investigating, several years, one trial, a second trial, abuse by the Justice Department, simply trampling the rights of an individual, another member of Congress. I cannot tell you the pain that it exacted on my family and my father personally. Fortunately and blessedly, we were able to survive the plentiful and oftentimes it seemed exhaustless resources of the federal government, for our prosecutors not to be reined in, for them not to have to comply with some sense of ethical conduct. Mr. Chairman, I submit to you it's un-American.
I think we've got to step back and reflect. This is really rather simple. It's about ethics. That's what it's about. It's about ethics. And the existing code of ethics that every single state prosecutor subscribes to ought to be applied to Department of Justice attorneys. I don't think that's asking too much. You know, we've heard a lot about law enforcement concerns, but that should not justify the creation of a lesser standards of ethics for federal prosecutors. It just doesn't work. You know, we should pause and think about the power of the prosecutor. And I know that power. I was an elected prosecutor for more than 20 years. I understand that power. I know what it can do to individuals. I know what it can do to families. And it should be exercised judiciously. And I submit that most prosecutors, federal and state, do that. The single admonition that I would instruct each and every assistant district attorney was to never abuse the power of that office. Never abuse the power of that office, because it is an enormous power. There's no power greater than in a democracy, where you have the capacity to take the individual liberties away from an individual. That is the ultimate power. And if that power is abused, it begins the process of erosion of a healthy democracy. I dare say that prosecutors should be held to the highest possible standards, the highest code of ethics, because the American people have given them an extraordinary power. Whether they're independent counsels, whether they're state prosecutors, whether they're United States attorneys.
I want to say to my colleagues on both sides of the aisle, this is not a political issue. This is an issue of fundamental fairness. I occupy the district immediately south to Joe McDade. You can't imagine what this government and those prosecutors did to that member of Congress. I don't know of any other member of Congress that could have withstood the leakage, the poisonous nature in which the public persecution occurred, not prosecution. Yes, it was lucky that Joe McDade had $1 million or could raise $1 million. But how many more Americans can do it? And that's the substantive question here. On the Conyers Amendment, does anyone in their right mind that doesn't understand at some point, and certainly next year, this Congress is going to have to decide what conduct we're going to allow prosecutors or special counsel to undertake? How far afield can they go from their assignment? What can they do? You know, I'm sort of embarrassed to bring up another issue, but we had a prosecution in Pennsylvania, and Joe McDade will remember this, and so will Jack Murtha, a treasurer of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, where the prosecutor was prosecuting on the improper award of a contract and brought a criminal action. And the witnesses in that case testified against the contractor, and the contractor was convicted of bribery. Within 1 month, the prosecutors in that case had those very same witnesses change their story 180 degrees to now testify against the treasurer of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania and threaten those witnesses by threatening prosecution of their wives and their children. And it's a famous story across this country. It was witnessed on television. The only way that treasurer could protect for the future of his family and maintain his pension was that before sentencing, he had to commit suicide, and did. Now, if that isn't extreme, extraordinary prosecutorial activity, I don't know what is. I've witnessed it in the case of Joe McDade. I'm witnessing it with this special counsel. You know, there are statistics now available. In the White House alone, the individuals working there have had to spend more than $12 million in hiring lawyers to appear in depositions and before grand juries who are not in any way substantially involved. And we're going on. Oh, what we're doing, and the American people know this, we're destroying the respect of the American judicial system. All with the idea that every now and then some prosecutor who wears pearl handles on his 45 can find somebody who has a grudge against an elected official, Republican or Democrat, who can make a point to bring a charge and substantiate that charge on just marginal testimony and sufficient to get an indictment, but not sufficient to convict. But you can take that public official down the road to ruination, that family down the road to ruination, our system down the road to ruination. And why? Why do we sit here? Why are we so innocent? Why haven't we recognized this has been happening over and over and over again? And why are we asking for the McDade-Murtha language? You know, it was an understanding in the bar and in the prosecutorial field and the defense field that there were certain standards of ethics and honor, certain things you didn't do, unwritten code. Well, the prosecutors in the United States today, whether they be special counsel or regular prosecutors, have shown us that they're going to push it to the end of the envelope and beyond. And they're going to write their own definition of what standards are. So it is incumbent upon this House, the people's House, to determine that if you're going to push it to the edge of the envelope and you're going to destroy lives and you're going to prosecute people unreasonably at high expense and detriment to themselves, the family, and this democracy, then this public house should take action. And actually, we're saying we want to codify the code of standard. We want to say what they have to do, what they don't have to do, and we might want to make them subject to a review board. What's wrong with that? Why shouldn't public officials and all Americans know that when they get taken by their government of hundreds of billions of dollars, hundreds of prosecutors, thousands of FBI agents, that they have a right not to be ruled? That's what the McDade-Murtha language and the perfecting amendment.
The time of the gentleman has expired.
Is going to I urge my colleagues to vote for rightfulness.
Jeff, I understand there was a heated political discussion of McDade-Murtha in the Black Congressional Caucus, even though the great majority of the members supported the bill and voted for it.
Yes, I understand that there was. I think it centers around, in particular, a kind of a controversial, ironic, ultimately, role that was played by Congressman John Conyers, a Democrat from Michigan. He is the senior-ranking Democrat on the House Judiciary Committee, and therefore his position on McDade-Murtha was rather significant. Now, paradoxically, Representative Conyers ultimately wound up voting against McDade-Murtha, and it was clear to members of the Black Caucus from the outset that that was his intention. Yet, at a certain point, he rose up during the floor debate and introduced an amendment to the McDade-Murtha bill, the component of the appropriations bill dealing with the Citizens Protection Act of 1998, that proposed to introduce explicit language that the independent counsels are also subject to the McDade-Murtha procedures. Now, even Conyers acknowledged that the independent counsel were at least implicitly already included, yet he felt that it was necessary to introduce what he called a perfecting amendment to make the independent counsel issue explicit. Given the fact that Conyers was opposed to the underlying bill, a number of people have speculated that he introduced the independent counsel issue as a way of perhaps turning this into much more of a partisan bickering, because obviously Kenneth Starr's attack against the presidency is a very partisan issue. What wound up happening, ironically, though, was something quite different. The momentum built up in support of McDade-Murtha, the concern about prosecutorial tyranny, in fact, spilled over into the Kenneth Starr issue. And when the vote came up, whether to include Conyers' quote, perfecting amendment to the McDade-Murtha language in the appropriations bill, 54 Republicans voted with the vast majority of Democrats, and as the result, the Conyers addition was accepted fully and was included in the bill. Now, I think this is rather extraordinary, and I think it demonstrates the fact that we have created a groundswell within the population and up on Capitol Hill for at long last taking on this judicial tyranny in whatever form it manifests itself. And it happens that Kenneth Starr is perhaps the single most egregious practitioner of the methods of tyranny itemized in the McDade-Murtha bill. So whatever Conyers' intentions were, the net effect of his effort was to, in fact, strengthen the debate to make it clear that this was a referendum against Kenneth Starr by, again, a vast bipartisan majority, 54 Republicans joining the vast majority of Democrats to include the Conyers perfecting amendment. Congresswoman Maxine Waters was another member of the Black Caucus whose role was initially ambiguous, but she actually, far more than Conyers, played a generally very positive role on the floor. She zeroed in on Starr, but also talked more broadly about the underlying McDade-Murtha bill. In fact, she was one of several people who said that whether or not the bill passes in its present form as an addition, Title VIII, to the appropriations bill, there must be congressional hearings. There must be a public airing of the cases of tyranny. We've talked about Frumention. We've talked about the LaRouche case. We've talked about Demjanjuk and other cases of OSI tyranny. Clearly, there are thousands of other cases all over the country where individual citizens who were far more vulnerable to the DOJ, in fact, suffered the same consequences and were really unable to defend themselves. So again, even what may have been initially efforts to undermine the momentum only proved to further the momentum ultimately.
What were the results of this inspiring debate, which is far different from anything people usually see from the Congress nowadays?
Well, I think it's noteworthy that you saw in the segments of the debate that we just aired that there were several points where there was spontaneous applause breaking out on the floor of the House. I can tell you that some of our own people who were in the galleries observing this historic debate confirmed that the spontaneous applause was bipartisan. What happened is that the Hutchinson Amendment, which would have struck the language of McDade-Murtha from the appropriations bill, came up for a vote, and it was resoundingly defeated. The numbers were 345 to 82 with 7 abstentions. And again, both Democrats and Republicans voted by about the same overwhelming proportion to, in effect, defeat the Hutchinson Amendment, which was a vote in favor of McDade-Murtha. And again, similarly, on slightly less dramatic numbers, the Conyers Amendment, including the independent counsel explicitly, was included in. So this was an extraordinary mandate. It's very important that the debate occurred. As I said, the next day, the entire appropriations bill came up and was voted up on largely partisan lines, but for issues that were completely unrelated to McDade Murtha. So what we had here was an unambiguous debate and then vote of support, bipartisan support, for the inclusion of the Citizens Protection Act in this appropriations bill.
Now, of course, this was a vote of only one of the two houses. It's not yet passed the Senate. It's not yet signed by the President. It's not yet law, nor have the hearings taken place, which are so important. Where do we go from here?
This is a very important point. Number one, Representative McDade has not withdrawn H.R. 3396, which is the self-standing identical version of the original McDade Murtha, because we don't know what's going to happen next. In September, when the House and the Senate return, there will be conference committee, and you will have delegates from the House and Senate Appropriations Subcommittee on Commerce, State, and Justice. They will meet and they will make a decision on common language to be brought back to both houses. So it's up in the air whether the McDade Murtha language will be included. We've looked at the composition of the Senate committee. We already know, obviously, that the House committee is going in there supporting inclusion of McDade Murtha. On the Senate side, the subcommittee is chaired by Senator Kay Bailey Hutchinson from Texas, who was herself a victim of attempted Justice Department persecution. The ranking Democrat is Senator Ernest Hollings from South Carolina, who has been an outspoken critic of Justice Department tyranny in a series of frame-ups of African-American elected officials in the Carolinas called Operation Lost Trust. Senator Dale Bumpers is another leading Democrat from Arkansas who has introduced separate bills curbing the powers of the Justice Department with respect to grand juries. And there are other Republicans and Democrats who are potentially favorable. So in general terms, there are fairly good prospects. But again, as with the initial McDade Murtha fight, the issue is going to be decided by the American public. There were countless American citizens who mobilized in every state of the Union to get their congressmen to support McDade Murtha. Now we've got to put the kind of pressure on these senators, but we're going to do something much more broad than that. We're not going to simply repeat the effective approach that we took on the House side. Right now, as we speak, there are town meetings taking place in major cities, small towns, all across the United States. We are broadening the issue of Justice Department tyranny to include not only the McDade Murtha fight per se, to ensure that it does pass into final legislative form, is voted up by both houses, and is signed into law by President Clinton. We also, of course, want hearings in both the House and the Senate on the underlying instances of Justice Department tyranny. But we've got to go broader than that, because the Justice Department is the cutting edge, is the enforcement arm of the international financial oligarchy, which today, in this period of tremendous financial and monetary crisis, the beginnings of a worldwide depression, the financial oligarchy is committed to turning the United States, Mexico, Canada, into three countries which are dominated by Nazi slave labor economic policies. In the case of the United States, you've got the Justice Department literally in the middle of this through the Bureau of Prisons. I should probably make mention of the fact that members of Congress, like Representative McCollum, a Republican from Florida, who was adamantly opposed to McDade Murtha, who voted with the prosecutors for the Hutchinson Amendment, has introduced a bill that would turn America's federal prisons into models of the IG Farben concentration camps of Nazi Germany by allowing private companies to come in and essentially create commercial factories using prison slave labor at the federal level, the way it's already going on in prisons at the state level all over the United States. You've got in Mexico, NAFTA, having turned the northern part of Mexico into a field of concentration camps where slave labor workers are toiling for $1 a day in tax-free zones. You've got now plans underway being discussed in the state legislatures in Arizona and Texas to export state prisoners to prison labor camps across the border in Mexico, where it can be done at even cheaper costs than in the United States. So we've got a much bigger issue here in which the Justice Department is the cutting edge of a new form of Nazi tyranny. Now, the McDade-Murtha mobilization makes it clear that this can be defeated. And so, Tony, I think that what we are looking at here is a situation in which there is an enormous opportunity to move the revolution forward. As you said, McDade-Murtha was a revolution on the floor of the House of Representatives. It's got to be replicated in the conference committee so that the Senate goes along with the McDade-Murtha initiative. It's got to be clear to every member of the Senate, and particularly those people on this conference committee, that the American population has not rested on its laurels, that it's not sufficient that the House debated and passed McDade-Murtha. We want hearings before the Congress. We want action on these other Nazi slave labor issues that are related forms of tyranny to what we're discussing here throughout the bulk of this broadcast, this special report on McDade-Murtha per se. So there's a lot of work to be done. The month of August is going to be crucial. We're seeing the financial crisis worldwide crashing down on the United States. We've got hour-by-hour instability and chaos on the stock markets. We've got the typical Nazi policy maneuvers coming from the financial oligarchy and their spokesmen in Congress, the people who opposed McDade-Murtha, pressing ahead for new and even more drastic forms of slave labor type policies in our prisons, through these various workfare programs, through the move to expand NAFTA, through these prison slave labor operations, and of course breaking the tyranny of the DOJ, breaking the chains that have enslaved the U.S. Congress for nearly 20 years is a critical step towards carrying the revolution further.
This has been a special edition of the LaRouche Connection on the McDade-Murtha House debate last Wednesday, August 5th, a revolution in U.S. politics. And as Jeff Steinberg noted, this fight will be continuing into the fall, and the LaRouche Connection will keep you informed.
It won the support of a bipartisan group of about 30 or 40 legislators. The McDade-Murtha bill proposed to create two things in particular. Number one, an outside supervisory agency to review allegations of corruption by officials of the Justice Department. And the bill itself, which is known as H.R. 3396, also included a specific itemization of some of the more egregious and most frequently committed crimes by federal prosecutors. For example, federal prosecutors withholding exculpatory evidence from defendants. That's to say, evidence that would tend to prove the innocence of a target of Justice Department prosecution. The soliciting of perjured testimony by witnesses to obtain convictions illegally. The bribing of witnesses, and there's many, many forms that witness bribery takes, and some of these are itemized in the McDade-Murtha bill. For example, offering witnesses who themselves have committed crimes, very often more serious crimes than those that the target is accused of. Prosecutors will routinely grant immunity from prosecution to people in order to get testimony against targets, political targets, of the Justice Department and of the private sector financial oligarchy, whose interests very often are those being pursued by the DOJ. So McDade-Murtha itemized all of these bills. It created an outside oversight board to review allegations of crime by federal prosecutors, the board to be appointed by the President and by leaders of the Congress. So that's one very big element of McDade-Murtha. The other thing that McDade-Murtha did was to assert that all officials of the Justice Department, and really this includes the independent counsels, which is a statute supervised by the Department of Justice, that all of these people are accountable not only to federal law, but to state ethical standards and state law as well. A good example of the kinds of things covered by McDade Murtha is the illegal tapes that Linda Tripp did of her conversations with Monica Lewinsky. Under McDade Murtha, it's questionable whether Ken Starr's office could have legally used the fruit of a state crime, the illegal taping in Maryland, which is now a subject of grand jury investigation, to further an investigation by the independent counsel's office. So this bill was introduced by McDade and Murtha early this year, and it got a certain amount of momentum, and then it sort of died out. Fortunately, a syndicated columnist, Paul Craig Roberts, published a column about McDade Murtha. It came to our attention, and we obtained a copy of the bill. Our legal staff at Executive Intelligence Review reviewed the bill and found that it was really an outstanding piece of legislation. It had no downside to it, no compromising elements. And at that point, the LaRouche political movement was activated all across the United States to win additional support for the bill. And beginning in about March of this year and extending through the department, permanent bureaucracy, there are various networks of influence within the Association of Assistant U.S. Attorneys, the Association of FBI Agents, other similar groups, as well as the Justice Department apparatus itself, launched a massive counter-effort to attempt to prevent additional members of Congress from endorsing the bill, to arm-twist members of Congress, exploiting some members who were former federal prosecutors, utilizing staffers who were former federal prosecutors. At one point, there were more U.S. attorneys, current and former, running around Capitol Hill lobbying and arm-twisting against this bill than any number of lobbyists you ever saw for the tobacco industry or for the pharmaceutical industry or other things. Attorney General Janet Reno, at one of her regular Thursday morning press conferences at the Justice Department in May, came out with a scathing attack against McDade Murtha. By the way, most of the, quote, facts that she cited in her opposition with McDade Murtha were all false. They were just simply trumped up allegations. At one point, prosecutors got so hysterical that they claimed that this was a bill to benefit drug traffickers, and it's nothing of the sort. So an enormous political brawl broke out, and as the result of that whole process, especially the continuing political mobilization of the LaRouche movement, which then instigated action by other constituency groups, everything from the National Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers to the organization representing state Supreme.
I just want the members of this House to know that I sat beside Joe McDade, a member of Congress, for 8 years while he was investigated for 6 years, the most insidious tactics you could possibly use against Joe McDade.
Welcome to a special edition of the LaRouche Connection on the McDade-Murtha House debate, a revolution in American politics. It's Wednesday, August 12, 1998. My name is Tony Pappert, and with me is EIR Counterintelligence Director Jeff Steinberg. Jeff, 1 week ago, last Wednesday, something happened on the floor of the House which most Americans would never have considered possible in this day and age. Could you tell us about it?
Well, not only would most Americans consider it impossible in this day and age, but most Americans are unaware of what happened on the floor of the House last Wednesday unless they happen to be fortunate enough to either be subscribers to Executive Intelligence Review or New Federalist, or happen to be glued to their TV sets last Wednesday watching the debate as it was aired on C-SPAN. What happened is extraordinary. There was a 3-hour debate on the floor of the House concerning the McDade-Murtha bill, otherwise known as the Citizens Protection Act of 1998. Now, this bill was introduced by Congressman Joseph McDade, a Republican from Pennsylvania, early this year. It was co-sponsored by another Pennsylvania congressman, a Democrat named Jack Murtha. And as the bill proceeded through early discussions among members of Congress, the 4th of July congressional recess, average citizens, LaRouche activists from every state in the Union engaged in perhaps the most substantial and important political mobilization that has been undertaken in this country in recent memory. Literally hundreds of members of Congress themselves met in their district offices or on Capitol Hill with LaRouche collaborators, very often average citizens, full-time jobs, full-time family responsibilities, but who've been drawn into this political movement. As the result of that effort, by the end of the 4th of July recess, the McDade-Murtha bill had 207 co-sponsors, and momentum was moving very rapidly towards getting 218 co-sponsors, which would have been a majority of members of the Congress. At that point, Representative McDade made a move which in hindsight has proven to have been a very sharp political move. He introduced the full text of the McDade-Murtha bill as an amendment to the House Appropriations Bill for the Justice Department, the State Department, and the Department of Commerce. That amendment was adopted by the Appropriations Subcommittee. It passed through the Rules Committee, and as the result, it was amended as Title VIII of the House Appropriations Bill for State Justice and Commerce. And as the result, it bypassed a certain process in committee and went directly to the floor of the House of Representatives. Now, as this process was unfolding, the Justice